The commission's interesting. I already had a pre-existing practice with regards to photography and a certain aesthetic that I carry on throughout my work. In essence, talking about light and dark spaces and narratives that potentially unfold within the scenes that I photograph. I came to this commission thinking I could produce something very much within those sort of perimeters. However, when I got here, obviously everywhere is different. My experience from previous work has been mainly based in London, from where I am, basically looking at the places around me and how I interact with those spaces that I either know well or at least have some idea as to what goes on in streets, in neighbourhoods, in areas. So this was very much from the perspective of an outsider, and I think in a lot of respects that helped, because I often look for this idea of someone on the outside looking into other people's worlds, and I can do that anywhere, but from this particular project it was very poignant because it's to do with Chinatown and my heritage. I'm half Chinese, and there's an essence of heritage with regards to the culture, so I have this connection already, but at the same time, being an outsider, I don't know the place, I don't know the people. It kind of sets me back, and there's this attraction, there's this sense of kind of belonging, but at the same time this sense of being an alien to this environment. So I think the tensions there are quite strong, and it's been particularly relevant for this project. There's something particularly stripped down and basic about my use of light, in that light produces an element of recognition. You understand what's being illuminated, and with that information as to where you are, what you're seeing, whereas darkness is this element of shrouding and covering and potentially mystery. So I'm always looking for this element of things sinking into the darkness as much as emerging into light, and it's this sort of tipping point between the two that I see as being the two, well, being the relevant kind of system within my works, to either see a narrative being produced or being shrouded. So yeah, I mean, there's obvious things like being afraid of the dark. That's one of the things. The difference between this project is often within my work I've looked at darkness being an element of anxiety, but with this project it's slightly different. It's more to do with how Chinese culture and Chinese signifiers are within Chinatown, whether they be colours or architectural items. And the use of darkness within this particular project has been more to look at how those signifiers kind of dissolve into the environment around them. And it's more looking at multiculturalism in certain respects, but also a sense of place, or a sense of non-place. Certain items like the Chinese gate has a place that refers to somewhere else, and the idea of sinking it into blackness is supposed to almost confuse the idea of two markers, two spaces being merged into one. So darkness in this particular project has been about merging cultures more than the idea of anxiety as such, which is something I've always looked at. I think there's this idea of Chinatown being marked out with colours down Nelson Street, but also architecture, the lampposts, the Chinese gate, various kind of like railings. There's this essence of a theme running through what has been kind of set aside as the cultural kind of Chinatown. And I was really interested in how they fit in with the rest of the streets and the architecture, and how in some respects they kind of they do merge in, but they're definitely kind of like, they stand out. They say this is the Chinatown. And for me that was interesting, because you end up looking at the space around you, really acknowledging that there is this proper clash of cultures. There isn't a subtle merging as such. It's very much prominent that this is where you are. And I think my perspective, at least, was to try and rein this back a little bit with my photography, and maybe produce works that looked at this architecture as more of a kind of a subtling, bubbling to the surface. Because I think, whilst those markers are very prominent, I was interested in the idea of this multiculturalism being a very gradual thing, because it has been a very gradual thing. And I think that for me is the essence of what I was looking towards when I was focusing in on this architecture. With regards to the colours, again, that's something that I'm particularly interested in, with regards to especially the colour red and the colour green, stripping these colours down to their prime kind of like functions to signify a Chinese-ness. The idea of taking away, for instance, a couple of the shop fronts I've photographed, I've removed the signage just to show red. The idea of that is to look at the spaces not as necessary spaces of commercialisation, not necessarily to do with the fact that they're shops, but the fact that they signify Chinese businesses. And my relationship with light is very sensitive, in that I look at the idea of light and in particular this colour red as signifying something associated with Chinese culture, and I wanted to take away the idea of it being a shop front, a shop sign where you actually read something, to the idea of this aura of a kind of a Chinese cultural theme spilling out onto the streets of Liverpool. And it also takes this idea of taking away noise from a scene. As soon as you see signs, you end up reading them. As soon as you take away language, you end up seeing how the light interacts with the streets around that building. And it's that sense of silence, that sense of contemplation that I wanted to communicate to people, and to not get confused with the other things going on around it. My mode of working with regards to photography in this project has always been to look at things, to look at scenes at night, the idea of light spill emanating from particular shops and particular buildings. The difference with Liverpool for me is that it only really works with light boxes as such, and I felt as though potentially I was missing the point by literally just looking at nighttime scenes. There would have been a lot that I would have missed out on. So I needed some way of incorporating the other aspects of the commission that I was interested in, architecture that you can only really see during the daytime. So it made me think, well, let's just shoot in the daytime and work with high contrasting shadows and light sources. But the same idea is still there. It's not necessarily about things emerging and with light spill onto the streets outside. It's become more about looking at how the architecture sits within an environment, but then stripping away things, for instance, like the sky dropping it to black, and essentially you have the same thing. You have buildings, you have architecture merging out of darkness, so there's this sense of finding still within the works. There is one particular piece that is more daytime than others. The man walking across the green shutters on Nelson Street. There's this sense of being on his own. I don't know who he is. I was basically catching him as a passerby. But I think possibly more poignantly is the idea of the reds, the greens, the shadow from the lamppost that has the peaked kind of Chinese elements to them. Potentially with this one, I was looking more at the colours. But again, he's on his own, he's a passerby. There's a very similar Hopper painting called, I think it's Early Sunday Afternoon or Sunday Morning, something along those lines. I'm pulling a lot from Hopper for my nighttime pictures, so I'm kind of looking at potentially how the same sense of being alone in a city can work with the daytime pictures as well. So I see them all as very similar in some respects, even though I'm going more into daytime imagery for the project. My entry point into the project, I could have gone two ways. I could have gone under the skin of Chinatown, but I think that's something that the sound agents have done particularly well. My side of things is very different. I don't feel as though I've engaged in the same way to show what Chinatown is really like. My project has always been to give us a particular view of Chinatown, and that's to do with multiculturalism on a very aesthetic basis, on a very abstract way. Have I done Chinatown justice? Potentially not, but it's not necessarily about that. I'm hoping that my impressions and my view of Chinatown can give the Chinese community and the people of Liverpool a different perspective of the space that they may know very well. And I think that's completely relevant. I think it's always good to revise our ways of looking at spaces and to throw that in the mix. I purposely wanted it to be very different from the existing new commission plus the two previous bodies of work, because I'm a very different artist, and I found it very difficult, in fact, to know that I've, as an outsider, with so many visits up to the city, to justify being completely true to the community. And from an early stage, I thought that the project's more about creating an aesthetic re-evaluation of the community, and that's what I believe I've done here. My father's Chinese from Hong Kong, my mother's Thai. They met in North London in the 60s. However, what I learnt more recently, probably about 10 years ago, is my grandfather came through Liverpool. What we're guesstimating it would be around 1895. So I think he was about 14 at the time. And I don't know if this is the case with other Chinese families, but I keep on getting little bits of information here and there, and I don't 100% know what happened, but the story goes that he was on a boat from Hong Kong, docked in Liverpool. Apparently he jumped off and swam ashore. I don't know if that's true or not. This could be my father elaborating. And he said that apparently he got to Liverpool and he found that not many people could speak Chinese at the time. I don't know if that's true or not. And I think maybe he didn't want to stick around. I think he tried to work here for a few months, and it didn't work out. I think he might have been doing laundry work. I'm not sure. So after those 2 months, he got on a boat again, went to Australia for 30 years, stayed there, and then went back to Hong Kong. Had my father, who then came back to England in the 60s. So, to be fair, I'd love to track down, if there were any records at all, of a Lau who was remotely on one of the boats during the mid-1890s, to find out if I can find any information on him at all. So, in the back of my mind, I know that he was here very briefly, and for me, that's really relevant, that there's some kind of distant connection 120 years ago. And I don't even know what Liverpool was like during that time. I've only seen Bert's pictures from the 40s, and that really looks very different. So, I'd definitely like to look it up a bit more and see if I can find anything else out about him.